I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the owners here at Politics and Prose Bookstore. And it is my pleasure tonight to welcome Moises Naim to Politics and Prose to talk about his new book, Illicit. I actually read this whole book in Galley about a month ago, and I was so impressed by it that I put it in our holiday newsletter. I thought it was really an important book. Our author comes with a very distinguished resume. He's been editor of foreign policy for more than a decade, and before that he was an executive director of the World Bank. I found that it was very interesting of how that he started into this book. I don't know whether that he would call himself naive. I may be overestimating that, but he started many years ago during his editorship that he wanted to investigate globalization further. And he said he started out being interested in the subject, and it wasn't very long before he was personally fascinated with the subject. He just couldn't get away from it, because that when he started to think about globalization, the more he read, he couldn't write something that was to say that globalization was good. He couldn't write something to say that globalization was bad, but he could write something to let us all know what we haven't known before, and that is globalization is very different than what we think of it so far. It's different in that it has a huge underbelly. We can't count it because it's all below the radar. A huge underbelly of commerce, which relies upon networks which are not different from Al-Qaeda networks. They're sophisticated networks, have a lot of good technology, they're stateless, and they can operate with extreme efficiency in moving arms, drugs, human beings, money, intellectual property, all those things across borders in an extent that we just are very, very ignorant of. And so that's exactly why that he wrote the book, Illicit. It's for all of us who have been naive before, it's a tremendous education of what is going on out there in our global economy, which we have just not known anything about before. So I welcome Moises Naim to Politics and Prose.
Thank you for the kind introduction and the opportunity, and thank you all for making the time to be here tonight. And let me start by telling you more about how I got involved in the book. As Barbara said, I am not a lawyer. I don't come from a background of law enforcement. I'm not a criminologist. I am the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and that puts me often in touch with people that are thinking about how the world is changing. And so we track what we call the surprises of the new interconnections, the new strange, very often surprising ways in which the world now is connected, and what happens there matters here, and vice versa. And that was my frame of mind. And in the mid-90s, I was walking the streets of Milan, and I ran into a street vendor that was selling very, very expensive bags for a fraction, a tiny fraction of the price that the original store just a few blocks away was selling them from. I engaged in a conversation with this person, and very quickly I discovered that he was as illicit as the bag he was selling. He had been trafficked from West Africa. He had to pay the traffickers to bring him to Italy, and he was now indebted to them. And he was working very long hours, horrible working conditions in order to try to repay what was obviously an unpayable debt. And after that, on my way back to the States, I stopped in New York, and I was walking the streets of Manhattan, and lo and behold, what did I find? Another street vendor that was selling exactly the same bag. I also started talking to this person and quickly discovered that he was as illicit as his bag, as illicit as his counterpart in Europe, except that they didn't know each other. They were from different countries, but the stories were identical. And so and then I started asking more, and then just think about the complexity of this operation. Just think about, first you have to steal the design from some company that is already aware that people are trying to steal their designs and therefore is very careful to protect it. And very often these counterfeits are marketed before. You can find the counterfeits before the original products are merchandised in many instances. So first you have to steal the design. Then you have to take it to some place in the world. Typically, very often, it's China. In China, you have to get all the raw materials, the buckles and the leather, the belts and everything that goes in that bag, assuming it's a bag. It could be a watch or it could be a garment. So you have to procure exactly the same materials, put it together, assemble it and manufacture it in the thousands. Then put it in containers and ship it to all the capitals of the world, more or less at the same time. And then use as your merchandising, as your retail operations, all sorts of trafficked people from different parts of the world. If you ask any top manager from a multinational corporations to do this, they will tell you that this is a very, very difficult managerial challenge. It's not easy to do this. Well, add to the fact that each one of these transactions that I just described is illicit, is a crime. And so just imagine the amount of money, the amount of complicity, the amount of government involvement that has to go into these trades. And then, of course, the profits are huge, the numbers are staggering, and that is what led me to look at other trades. And I looked at the trade in narcotics, the drugs, the trade in weapons, from small arms to weapons of mass destruction, nuclear bomb-making technology, to endangered species. All kinds of logging goes on that is illegal and illicit and traded at billions. Industrial waste. The more countries become aware of environmental pollution and the more they pass laws, the more there is an incentive for people to outsource the disposal of the garbage. So they're willing to pay others to take it and dispose it. And there are others willing to do that for a price, and very often they dispose it somewhere else. Somewhere else is typically a place where, again, governments are willing for a bribe to allow the dumping of this industrial waste. This is a huge industry worldwide. And I started looking at all of these things, all of these trades, and discovered that they're changing the world. That's the main point of the book, is that these markets, these illicit markets, these black markets, are changing the world. This is a very bold assertion to make, because illicit trade, black markets, smuggling, has been with us since time immemorial. The first time a government or an authority attempted to stop human beings from moving goods or people from one place to another through a border, that's the moment where smuggling started to appear in the history of humankind. So smuggling, black markets, illicit trades are very old. So why is it that I can argue, or that I'm willing to argue, that illicit trades today are even more important and are transformational? And that's the point. That's what I try to do in the book. And in a nutshell, the argument is that it's no longer that they have grown in size and they are now global. And I will talk a little bit about that. But very importantly, is that they have become far more political. They have now intertwined with governments, government officials, in very complex ways. And they are transforming the way politics is conducted, both in some specific countries, at regional levels, and there are even more global international political consequences. Let me first talk a little bit about the numbers. And again, the very valid question is, where are these numbers coming from? Because all of these are secret, illicit activities. How do you measure it? Well, there are ways of measuring directly. There are estimates. There's arguments about the estimates. And, you know, are we talking about the human trade, the trade in human beings? Is it $7 billion or is it $12 billion? Well, you could argue about that. What no one argues is that they are shrinking. There is not one single expert that has seriously looked at these markets that will tell you that today these markets are smaller in volume and scope that they were 10 years ago. No one. And there are indirect indicators. In drugs, the number of drug busts is always interpreted to be a fraction of what really goes on. Money laundering is a very interesting proxy, because at the end of the day, all of these trades generate profits and revenues that have to enter into the arteries of the international financial system. So you somehow measure money laundering, you have a guess of these things. The money laundering has grown 10 times to what it was in 1990. It is today 10 times larger, and it's over a $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion in today, and it's 10% of all legitimate trade. This is one estimate that is considered by some to be conservative. There are other larger estimates. But if you take the most conservative one, it is huge. Drugs. Some of you may remember a movie called The French Connection about the heroin trade in Marseille. Remember, the numbers there were tiny compared to what they are today. In 1991, for example, even a few decades after the French Connection, the illegal trade in drugs was reckoned to be at about $61 billion. Today, it is estimated at $900 billion. Counterfeits. Counterfeits used to be shoddy and, remember, made in Hong Kong and made in Taiwan. It always existed, but it was not a very huge trade. Now, it is very sophisticated, almost identical, and it's $630 billion per year. Illicit weapons is about the illicit trade in weapons, small arms. We're not talking aircraft carriers and tanks. We're talking small arms that accounts for thousands of deaths each day in the world. It is estimated that only 3% of the small weapons now in circulation in the world are in the hands of law enforcement and governments. 97% of the small weapons are in the hands of individuals and armed militia groups. Toxic waste dumping across borders, $12 billion. And as I mentioned, the trade in people is large. It is growing. It is about $10 billion per year. And just a factoid, it took 400 years to bring 12 million people from Africa to the New World during the slave trade. Just in the last 10 years, 30 million people have been trafficked in Asia. So it is acquiring spectacular volumes, size. It is also becoming far more global, far more international. And it's having, as I said, is having very important consequences in the way in which governments work everywhere. When I looked at the trades, I found that they had, even though they're very disparate, the trade in DVDs is certainly very different than the trade in marijuana or the trade in people. Yet I found similarities. Many, but let me just highlight 4. The first is that in all cases, these trades pit governments against markets. In all single instance of those that I described, there are governments trying to contain, trying to stop these activities from going on. First. And that says that this is much about money and about profits. In the book, I keep repeating that these trades is not about, they're not driven by low morals. They're driven by high profits. And approaching these trades just as a morality tale will only take you so far, because there will be profits and will be circumstances and will be human deeds that will be completely immune to morality appeals, or appeals to morality. That's the first. It's markets and governments trying to contain the markets. The second thing that was very interesting to me is that all of these markets are now global. The importance of geography is no longer that important. The same forces of globalization that shrunk the world in the 90s and that allowed non-governmental organizations to go global and operate in multiple countries, environmental groups, human rights groups, and the such, faith-based groups that are collaborating internationally, terrorists, businesses that are now can operate across borders and across the world far more easily than they were able to do it before, thanks to what the transformational, revolutionary technologies of the 90s, of course, new technologies, and the internet, prepaid phone cards, cheap travel opportunities everywhere, together with the revolutions of the 90s that opened the borders, the political changes of the 90s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the opening of China, the dismantling of a lot of the trade barriers that existed in the world, governments that initiated economic reforms that essentially aimed at allowing a freer exchange of people, money, ideas, goods. All of that dissolved the sealants that governments used to rely upon to control the borders. And all of that made life easier for the traffickers and harder for governments. And all of that also contributed to make geography less of a factor. That is why in the book I tell the stories of Nigerian traffickers operating northern Thailand, Ukrainian weapons traffickers working in cahoots with Bolivian and Colombian drug traffickers that in turn launder the money through Russian networks of money launderers in New York. Moroccan traffickers of people and hashish working with Spanish traffickers of counterfeits, and so on. What you see is these different nationalities, these different groups working along long-range distances and coordinating. The other thing that's very important is that these groups are no longer the mafia. The mafia model, where you had a pyramid, you had a boss, and then the boss had some underlings, and then there were some captains and lieutenants, and the typical, that's no longer the way this operates. It's about cells. It's about small groups, stateless, agile, wealthy, ruthless, violent, and capable of moving very quickly and shifting from one market to another depending on opportunities and threats. And one day they can be trading women for prostitution, and the next day they can be trading on stolen cars or smuggled cigarettes. They are specialists in logistics. They are specialists in transportation. They are specialists in how to move goods and people across borders, goods and people that are prohibited from moving across borders. And those very agile networks are not bound by geography, and that's why they can create opportunities and work together with like-minded operational networks elsewhere, and just create a network that has this ability to work from Africa and connect Africa to South Asia and Russia and New York. That was my second common characteristic for all these trades. The third has to do with borders, national boundaries. As I already said, national boundaries have become a blessing for traffickers and a nightmare for governments. Governments are designed and operate to live inside national borders. The natural habitat for a government is inside the country, inside their jurisdiction. For a government official, for a government agency to operate across borders is as artificial as any of us to work on the water. They need as much support and as much artificial lungs to work across borders as we need to work on the water. Governments are essentially domestic. Of course, you can have treaties and you have embassies and you have ambassadors, but all of that requires very complex artificial constructs among governments, bureaucracies that are slow and cumbersome and difficult. While the habitat of governments is national, is inside borders, the natural habitat of traffickers is in between, is across borders. They thrive in the world of in between borders, across borders, transnational, stateless. And so borders provide to traffickers first the profit opportunities, because it's what creates the price differences. Is what allows them to buy very inexpensively in one place and sell very expensively in another place across the border. And borders also provide shelter. You commit a crime in one place and you move across the border. And of course, there is extradition and there is the Interpol and there is all of that. But all of that is slow. and difficult and complex. And these are far wealthier, fast-moving, and agile than all of the law enforcement capabilities that are trying to contain them. That's the third. The fourth common characteristic is a worrisome one, and that is that no government can claim any success in containing these traits. There is not one single instance in which any government can tell you that they have achieved sustained success in curbing these markets. Think about the drug trade. The war on drugs in this country was launched by Richard Nixon decades ago. It now costs an estimated $40 billion a year. Each year, this country spends $40 billion in trying to contain the importation of drugs and contain the distribution of drugs. Yet, government statistics show that that drug use has not declined significantly, that drugs are widely available. There is no evidence that in our high schools drugs are hard to get. In many high schools, it's harder for high schoolers to get a pack of cigarettes than to get a cigarette of marijuana, despite all the efforts. Think about weapons. Think about when was the last time that anyone heard that an armed guerrilla movement, a militia, had to go out of business because it couldn't get the weapons or the ammunition it needed. There are none. If a group is armed and active and has some funding, it will get the weapons. Despite the embargoes and the blockades, the military interventions and the treaties and the United Nations and the European Union, still, if you have an insurgency and you have money, you're going to get the weapons. Think also about counterfeits. When was the last time that any of us felt any jitter about purchasing one of these counterfeits in the streets? That's a riskless activity. You can just go out and buy a counterfeit bag, a watch, a garment, no risks. But of course, we have a lot of complaining and a lot of anxiety about the counterfeiting industry, looking at the source, not looking at the demand. Think about the trafficking in people. Before 9/11, about 500,000 illegal immigrants entered the United States each year, on average during the 90s. After 9/11, there was a surge of anxiety and need to protect and fortify the borders. And this country passed several laws and Patriot Act and made it more difficult to enter the country. Recently, a study showed that after 9/11, the number of illegal immigrants entering the United States is 500,000, exactly the same as it had been in the 90s. Or money laundering. I asked a Swiss banker how much more difficult was it now for him if a client came and asked him to, quote unquote, manage $50 million. And by manage, I mean hide it from governments and move it around the world. How more difficult it is now? Well, he smiled and told me, well, the only difference is now I charge more. And that is confirmed by a study. There's a book out just recently by the International Institute of Economics by two very well-known, respected experts that studied the effects of the anti-money laundering system now in place. Again, after 9/11, the idea was that if you control the sources of funds of the terrorists, you can first monitor them and also try to dry up their supply lines, so to speak. And so they studied for 4 years all sorts of methods that were used to try to estimate the impact of the anti-money laundering system, which is very expensive. It is very active, it's very aggressive, and their conclusion was that the probability of being caught if you're a money launderer in the United States is 5%, and far lower elsewhere. So the point is that in all of these instances, the markets are growing, and the governments are failing at containing the growth. Which brings me to the inevitable question, well, what to do? What to do? The book has a chapter, the book Illicit has a chapter titled What to Do. in which there are several specific initiatives and ways of acting are described. And here I will just mention three. First is that it's very important to have a more frank national conversation about these things. Essentially, around all of these trades, there is huge hypocrisy. When people ask me about what is my book about, well, my book is both about arbitrage and hypocrisy. Arbitrage is the name that traders and financiers use to buying in one place at one price and selling at another at a higher price. That's arbitrage. And hypocrisy is what surrounds the national conversation about all these things. We are very worried about illegal aliens and about illegal workers. And but the fact of the matter is that American companies don't face much risks in employing these illegal workers. The number of fines that the American government has imposed in corporations for hiring illegal aliens has dropped 82% in a decade. The total number of companies fined in this country for having employed illegal aliens in the last year for which we have numbers is 2003. The number of companies fined was 124. There are whole industries, and we all benefit from illegal workers here. Many of us eat at restaurants, and if you just enough to go to the kitchen and see who is working in the kitchens, and you'll see that many of them are illegal workers. The food we eat is cheaper because of illegal workers. Our children and our elderly are taken care increasingly by illegal workers. Yet, the national conversation is about the need to stop and cut and expel. The most extreme versions of it is to expel illegal workers. Same with drugs. There is the United States is the country in the world that has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. There are 7 million people in jail in this country. A large number of them are in jail because of drugs, and not only because they're drug traffickers, but many of them are just caught with drugs. Many of them are caught with marijuana. Yet, marijuana is amply available. Cocaine is widely available. And yet, it continues to be this prohibition that essentially is highly hypocritical. The same is example with counterfeits. As I said before, when was the last time that anyone worried about buying a counterfeited fake watch? In fact, it has become part of the lifestyle. We joke about it. And so on. So, very little will happen. And it's almost pointless to talk about what to do if we first don't talk about the double standards that we use in talking about these things. And after we accept this reality, the notion that we have to look at these trades in a more selective way. By no means I am an advocate of getting the government out of trying to contain these trades. There are some of them that are harrowing, that are horrible, and that threaten all of us, our families, our stability, and our futures. I want the government to be very, very effective at controlling the international trade in small children, or in women exploited for prostitution, or on weapons of mass destruction. But I don't know if it is the best use of our collective taxpayer money to have governments chasing after all of the DVD trade, or the chase of marijuana. Unavoidably, the government has to be more selective. We will make no progress if we ask the government to be in a total prohibition mode in all of these trades. That is set government to failure, and therefore set ourselves to failure. Thank you very much, and let me stop here and just take your questions. Yes, thank you.
If you could come to the mic, please. Oh, sure.
What a great talk. You'll be happy to know that in Venice, they have a brochure now in every single hotel advising you not to buy these handbags that are sold on the street.
Good luck.
My question, yeah, right. My question, and a fine, there's a huge fine if you do. My question concerns illegal drugs and medicalizing drugs. It seemed to me for a long time that if they were medicalized, That is to say, you could get them through your doctor if you're an addict, and if they were sold like alcohol and cigarettes and taxed, that the government would start facing reality and stop, as you say, chasing after this. It hasn't worked. It's been how many years and how much money? I wonder what your thought is.
Yeah. I agree with you. That's I interviewed the book in the book I mentioned an interview I had with a senator, and the senator was very candid with me and told me, I know that what we're doing with drugs is not working, and I know that we have to change it, but I also know that the moment I say this, I'm going to be voted out of office. That is why the conversations about these straits have to start not in Capitol Hill, but in our dinner tables. And that is why we have to be more frank. I am not for the legalization of drugs across the board. I think there, what's happening in this country with methamphetamines, which is terrible, needs to be regulated and controlled. But look at cigarettes. The number of teenagers that are smoking cigarettes is going down. And the campaign that this country has waged, persuading and educating people that smoking cigarettes kills, has been very effective. Yet, because we have the illusion that there are no drug smoking because it's illegal, there are no campaigns that to speak of. There is just a fraction of the $40 billion that we are spent each year in this country to try to, on the war on drugs. Only a fraction is spent on education. The rest is spent on high seas chasings and all the telegenic, far more sexy activities that are associated with the drug trade. And by no means I want to deride. There are some heroes doing this, and there are people, there are law enforcement and drug enforcement individuals that are risking their lives on a daily basis, on a very risky endeavor. But they are the first to know that, and they are the first to tell you that doing it the way we're doing it is not working.
Well, I confess that I am the owner of a counterfeit Hermes bag. My question is, whom do you hope to influence with this book? Who will could take a strategic part in stopping the dark side of globalism?
As I said before, nothing will happen unless you and people that are watching on television and others that are reading the book start understanding and begin to understand, and that just denouncing these trades and not at the same time consuming and benefiting from them is a double standard that is threatening us. And my point is that this is not just crime. One of the most dangerous intellectual complacencies I see around today is the notion that crime has been around forever. Crime is as old as humanity. And therefore, this is just but one more expression of crime and criminal activity. And so it comes with the territory of being human and living in society. There's nothing new here. Well, the point of my book is that there's plenty that is new, and if we don't pay attention, it's going to erode very fundamental principles on which we live and like to live, and would like to continue living. And therefore, the first message is to first connect the dots. It is very interesting after, if you read the book, you will start discovering that you read the newspaper in a different way. Each day, you will find in the newspapers and in the news reports of busts of different kinds, of activities of different kinds. And if you start connecting them and discover that and realize that they're part of the same phenomenon that I'm describing, it is a different way of understanding where the world is heading. You cannot understand how decision-making is taking place today in China without understanding the impact of the illicit economy. You cannot understand things like reconstruction, national reconstruction in Iraq, without understanding the role of crime. You cannot understand international trade, international finance, if you don't take into account these things. And you would only do so by integrating the views and understanding that these are manifestations of a single phenomenon driven by globalization, which in turn was boosted by the technological and political changes of the 90s. So the first message is for all of us that eventually will go to politicians and create the political will to do things differently.
I'm Alan Mandel. I think that the growing problem that you describe is truly frightening. On the other hand, there's also the issue of civil liberties. Some people who profess to be against illicit trade would advocate solutions that would lead to the instigation of a police state and the erosion of civil liberties. Could you talk about that?
That's a great point, and I thank you for raising it. I do talk about it in the book, and there is a tension between fighting and trying to contain some of these and taking for granted some of the civil liberties and privacy. And what we have, all I have to say at this point is that there is new technology coming online that will erode some of these civil liberties. And what you have also noticed is that these are tools. And as tools, what's important is not only the tools, but who uses them. And so when you put these tools in the hands of governments, we have a long history of governments misusing tools in horrible ways. But at the same time, this is a debate that we cannot avoid. At the same time, every society has to go through the debate of balancing what are the impacts of some of these illicit trades is having in the fabric of society and the values and security of everyone, and what are the erosions of civil liberties that are going to go. And you saw it. You saw it after 9/11. You saw a country that was very willing to put up with and tolerate changes that were intolerable before. You saw the tolerance for closed-circuit TV cameras after the bombings in London. Now, you know, before everybody was apprehensive about that. Now people are willing to live with those if they provide a modicum of more security. Will that yield to abuses? Probably. It's unavoidable, and it has happened in history that governments, given powerful privacy intruding technologies, will use them abusively. But one has to trust that there are checks and balances that will operate. And again, it's a debate that we need to have, and that I refuse to just make a blanket statement that therefore, because civil liberties are important, no technologies and no initiatives should be considered, or to say that because these trades are threatening us, we should throw all civil liberties out the window. I don't think that any of the two captures what the complex debate we have to have as a country and as a world.
Good evening, Mr. Naim. In your research, what have you uncovered on the illicit trade in components to construct a tactical nuclear weapon, nuclear bomb, and how complicit are various groups in this underworld with governments such as Iran, North Korea, formerly Pakistan, QA Khan's network? I believe this is perhaps the single most dangerous of the illicit problems that you were discussing. And how close, in your estimation based on your research, are we, perhaps time-wise, in all of this coming together in an actual construction of a tactical nuclear weapon that could be brought across the border and detonated in a city such as Washington or New York?
I agree with you that of all the trades I discuss, the trade in bomb-making nuclear materials is the most dangerous. And that's what I said. I am more willing to tolerate the illicit trade in counterfeit DVDs and Hollywood movies and have government center closely on these others. The illicit trade in nuclear materials exists and is large, and it poses a fantastic paradox about how to see the world from the perspective of the book and from our traditional ways of thinking about international politics. As this country was transfixed, all of us were transfixed for the invasion of Iraq. The United States was going to go in because of weapons of mass destruction, and they need to contain that. Weapons of mass destruction that were never found. At exactly the same time, there was this illicit network led by a Pakistani engineer called A.Q. Khan, who is the father of Pakistan's atomic program, that he had gone private. in the name of ideology and the national interest, all that, but at the end of the day, it was a for-profit operation. He had operations, he had partners in South Africa, he had a manufacturing operation in Malaysia, he had banks in the Gulf, in the Middle East, and operations that also touch Switzerland and so on. It was a very complex network, not unlike the ones I have described here, except that the specialty was it was centrifuges. It was a machinery and a technology that is needed to manufacture atomic bombs. And he was doing it for profit, not for God, not for religion, not for politics. He was doing it for profit. Of course, he would tell you that he was doing it to advance a cause and so on. And there is evidence that he was captured when in trying to, when it was discovered that he was shipping these things to Libya. And there is suspicion that he might have sold it elsewhere. A very top intelligence official said that AQ-CAN will go down in history as having destabilized the world and created more insecurity than some of the worst destabilizers of the world in the 20th century. So there is, and he's not alone. There are Scud missiles that have disappeared in Ukraine. There are missile-propelled manpads, we call them, which are rockets, rocket launchers that can bring down an airliner. There is a market for that. And so, yes, there is a market for that, and it is big money, and profits are involved, and therefore that's the area where I would like governments to concentrate the most and be more effective.
Thank you so much for your work.
So could you please talk about the government itself being involved in corruption? And where I'm going with this question is, for example, government sells property or gives a seal on property in Egypt or India very quickly to large businesses that intellectuals or the upper class like us want to travel to through a Marriott, want to stay in a Marriott. But the Marriott really got the property using the government to seal the property very quickly for its name, versus it takes 1 year for the local to buy the same property unless they provide corruption to the government for $30,000 or whatever, you know, what almost the value of the property. So the government is actually involved in corruption, and we are, you know, the upper class who wants to stay in these places, feed the corruption. And this is another form of illicit, you know, work. But, you know, could you talk about us actually contributing to the problem as well as the government?
Yes, corruption, corruption is as old as humanity, and I don't mean to say that therefore there is anything new under the sun, and that therefore corruption has become. And I want to be very specific about the sort of government involvement that I am talking about in these illicit trades. I'm talking, for example, about the fact that the head of the security forces and one of the most influential individuals in Peru, by the name of Vladimiro Montesinos, who during the 90s was in charge of that country's intelligence, anti-drug and anti-guerrilla movements and all of that, is today in jail because he's accused of having been the leader of a network that was active in trading weapons and drugs and laundering money. I'm talking about the former president of Lithuania, that is now was impeached when he was caught in conversations with some elements of a network, of a Russian network that obviously had him in the payroll. I'm talking about, and again, there are two kinds here. There is the government involvement that is just some bad apples, some corrupt individuals that are being bought off by these networks that could not operate and could not get to the numbers I have given without government involvement. And so there are some bad apple cases, but then there are some structural governments. There are governments that are structurally criminal, that have, and think again about different Belarusia. In Belarus, it is an example. Transnistria is another example. North Korea, there's plenty of evidence that the North Korea government is very actively involved and engaged in all sorts of illicit trades and uses illicit trades to fund its operations. So these are structural conditions, and there are governments that are structurally involved. And that is what makes it very difficult, because in order to stamp out some of the things, you have to work with different governments. And so how do you work with different governments if you don't know that the people with whom you are collaborating are in fact complicit with the networks?
The question I was trying to ask was, the government actually causing the problem? For example, with the corruption and the real estate in the the public works and real estate, they actually create a bigger gap between the rich and the poor, and so the poor become available for trafficking as,
well,
people.
Your
or
general
whatever.
point is well taken. That is, corruption very often is a major source both of slow growth, slow economic growth, and more poverty and more inequality, and that feeds the trades. That's absolutely right. Thank you.
I'm sorry I got here late. You may have already touched on this. But I was wondering if you could address, to what extent is one man's illicit economy another man's informal sector? And if one accepts the notion that the informal sector is a major importance to growth in a lot of developing countries, where do you draw, what are the linkages between the two? Where do you draw the line? What is the distinction?
That's a great question. And I just wrote a column called the Illicit Continent. I was talking about Latin America. Recently, there was a summit of presidents, of Latin American presidents, that could not agree. They were fighting over free trade. There's a group of presidents, the United States and many others, that, as I do, think that free trade is good for the region. And there were other group of presidents led by Hugo Chavez of Venezuela that essentially don't like the idea of free trade agreements like the ones we have seen. And there was this furious battle, and they couldn't even agree. While that battle was raging, Latin America, illicit trade was tying the north or the south of the continent in very powerful ways. Free trade may not be booming in Latin America and in the hemisphere, but illicit trade surely is. There is more money being sent each year by Latin American immigrants back to their countries than all of the money sent by all of the multinationals put together, all of the foreign aid doled out by the US government or the European Union. The poor of Latin America that have moved elsewhere, notably here in the United States, are sending more capital to the region than all of the multinationals in the world. Very often, those individuals are illicit. And very often, the channels they use, because they're illicit, they don't have bank accounts and so on. So the channels they have to use to send the money back to their families are also illicit. Latin America exported $75 billion worth of agriculture last year. The equivalent numbers in drugs is many, many times higher. So again, well, formal free trade may not be booming. Illicit trades are. Half of the employment in Latin America is informal. These are informal workers that are not part of a normal economy and a normal payroll. And only 2% of Latin American companies are classified as large. And even those that are large are very small by world standards. So Latin America seems to create a habitat, a conditions that inhibits the formal economy and facilitates the informal, often illicit economy. And that is in support of your point that very often that's the only option. Being illicit, being informal, is the only option that a significant chunk of mankind has to make a living.
Okay, let's take the 4 people who are live, and after the last gentleman live, we're going to have to cut it off.
I recently read an article written by you where you argue that the war on corruption has been actually a bad medicine for developing countries. I was wondering if you care to comment on that.
Yes, you're referring to an article where I argued that there is, in the 90s, a very powerful movement against corruption appeared in the world and created all sorts of initiatives. And my argument was that the cures that we have been using have been ineffective and in fact counterproductive. It's not because I am for corruption, because that would be like being for cancer. All I'm saying is that the cures we're using for that cancer are very often killing patients, and we have no evidence that they have cured anyone.
You mentioned earlier that you believe in sort of selective enforcement, that there are trades that you would like to see being cracked down on, like the nuclear trade, but there are other trades that you would be okay tolerating for the time being. I was wondering if you could comment on the human trafficking trade, because I know that it certainly lands people in a horrible predicament sometimes, like the people you described, who are financially bound to crime organizations. But I think it also bears asking about people like asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution in other countries, and who for them, human trafficking is the only way out. And so I was just wondering if you think we should enforce more or less, or you think it's good or bad.
The people trafficking has two components. Has one, a group of people that is the great majority that are voluntarily trafficked. Is the mother in Guatemala that seeks a coyote, a trafficker, and pays him money to take her to the United States. And that is a very human, basic impulse to get more money and to be able to put more food and hopefully a future, and give a future to the children. And she's doing this voluntarily, and if she's caught, she's going to do it again and again and again until she achieves a better future and a better situation for her family. And I could tell you it's the Guatemalan woman, but it could be the Chinese cook, or it can be the Albanian mother that goes to Italy, or the Moroccan father that sends his 19-year-old boy in a rickety boat to Spain in the hope that he will find work and a future. So these are very human impulses. And then there is the other dimension of people trafficking, which is the horrible kidnapping, the horrible abuse, exploitation, and all of that, in which people are, and very often they mingle and they mesh, because you hope, the woman from Albania hopes to go to London to work as a nurse, and then she's kidnapped, beaten up, exploited, and forced to work as a prostitute. And so that is the kind of thing that I think needs a lot of enforcement, a lot of control, and a lot of government, effective government intervention. The other one is nothing but one of the great challenges of our time, which is migration. And migration touches everything, and we have seen the riots in France, and the debates about multiculturalism, and the difficulty of sealing our borders, and all of the issues on migration. Again, whenever you hear a silver bullet, a one-liner about migration, be very suspicious, because it's probably not very precise. You cannot open the borders and allow everyone that wants to come here to come here. Closing the borders and hoping that fences and moats and walls are going to do the job is also an illusion. And so what we know is that what we have is not working. What we know is that we have creating the mousetrap effect. The mousetrap, once the mouse enters into the trap, can never leave. We have created a situation where the people that come here for work, it's so costly, it's so risky, it's so dangerous that once they are here, they have a very hard time going back. And so facilitating turnover and allowing them to come and go more often may be a solution. We don't know that it will work. And in all of these, one needs to be very open-minded and experimental, and some of these ideas may not work. But start with the premise that we have, for a long time, suffered with a collective learning disability disorder. We have had a great difficulty learning from experience. We have been prone to repeating again and again policies that we know do not work. And yet we have this social constructed difficulty of accepting that some of the things that we're doing are not working. I don't know what works. What I know is that it's worth experimenting.
Mary Dominic, former liaison for a senator to the Iran-Contra Committee. I wondered whether in your research you had heard of the Mina cartel in Arkansas, a dirt strip north of Little Rock, where drugs were run from Nicaragua, allegedly or purportedly by CIA, and whether or not you addressed this. It comes to the point about the cure. Perhaps the people promoting the cure are perpetrators, and I'm not quite as optimistic as you are in your last chapter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I know exactly the case you mentioned. It is one of many. The truth of the matter is that this is just one more episode where traffickers and the profits available generate all sorts of very innovative, very bold, very difficult initiatives. And we have seen plenty. We have seen tunnels being dug under the border. We have seen the Colombian traffickers once purchasing a Russian submarine and retrofitting the submarine to be able to carry drugs. We have seen also, if you go into the actual details of how this is done, you will find that there is there's boundless creativity in trying to move banned goods across borders, because at the other end of the border is a pot of gold. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.